Okay, so imagine you go to a doctor's office, you step on a scale, and 2 years later, without surgery, without changing your entire life, you lost 85 pounds. Not the best case scenario, not the person in the trial who happened to respond perfectly, just the average person, 85 pounds on average over 2 years from a weekly injection. That is the headline from a phase 3 clinical trial that dropped last week for a drug called Retatrutide. And today, we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what you should take away from it versus what the hype machine wants you to believe. Today on the Weekly Shot, we're going to go a little bit deep on this one. So stick around and let's get into it. All right. So before we talk about the trial, we need to talk about the drug itself because understanding what retatrutide is makes the results make a lot more sense. And to be clear, I'm talking about the real retatrutide, the Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. Ain't nothing like the real thing version, not to be confused with the for research only or not for human consumption version. No shade to Ray Retta. I just want to be clear we are talking about the on brand version of this medication. You've probably heard of Ozempic at this point, unless you've been hiding under a rock, maybe Wegovy, maybe Zepbound. These are the drugs that belong to a class called GLP-1 receptor agonists. GLP-1 is a hormone your body naturally produces. It tells your brain you're full. It slows down how fast your stomach empties. It helps regulate insulin. These drugs basically mimic and amplify that signal. They make your body think it's more satisfied than it actually is. Ozempic, that's one hormone, GLP-1 only. It works famously well, honestly, but it's just one lever. Then came Zepbound, which is tirzepatide, made by the same company that is making Retatrutide, Eli Lilly. That one hits two hormones, GLP-1 and GIP. That's two levers. And the results were even better than Ozempic. People lost more weight more consistently. So naturally, the next question was, what if we pulled three levers? That's retatrutide. It activates GIP, GLP-1, and glucagon receptors, a triple agonist, which is, by the way, the coolest possible way to describe a weight loss drug. Triple agonist. Sounds like a superhero team. Now, glucagon is interesting because glucagon is actually associated with burning energy. It tells your body to release stored glucose to rev up your metabolism. So, theoretically, you're not just eating less, you're also burning more. That's the idea behind adding the third receptor. And this is the first drug in its class to do all three. First in class, they call it. So the trial is called Triumph 1, which is an extremely confident name for a clinical trial. And honestly, it earned it. Here's the setup. This was a phase 3 trial, which is the big one. This is the stage where you're testing in a large group of real patients before going to the FDA for approval. It's double blind, placebo controlled, which means some people got the real drug and some people got a fake shot, and nobody knew which was which. That's the gold standard for clinical research. They enrolled 2,339 people, all adults, all with obesity, or at least overweight with a related health problem. Think high blood pressure, high cholesterol, sleep apnea, that kind of thing. No one in the main trial had type 2 diabetes. That's being studied separately. The average person starting this trial weighed about 248 and a half pounds with a BMI of 40. For reference, a BMI of 30 is a threshold for obesity. A BMI of 40 is what's classified as severe or class 3 obesity. So these are real people with real significant weight challenges. They had three dose groups, 4 milligrams, 9 milligrams, and 12 milligrams, all given once a week by injection. And they started low and worked up slowly, which is how all these drugs work to help your body adjust to minimize side effects. And they ran this for 80 weeks. That's a year and a half, basically. Then a smaller group continued for an additional 24 weeks. So 104 weeks total, about 2 full years. All right, before we get into the headline numbers, we need to establish the baseline. The main 80-week trial, Think of this as the foundation. This is what the FDA will judge the drug on primarily. And honestly, even these numbers alone would have been a huge deal. The placebo group, the people who got the fake shots, lost about 5.5 pounds on average over those 80 weeks, which actually makes sense. When you're in a clinical trial, people are paying more attention to their health, eating a little bit better, moving a little bit more. So, weight loss, even on placebo, is pretty normal. Now, the drug groups. The 4 milligram dose, the lowest, people lost on average 47 pounds. That's 19% of their body weight. And here's what's wild about that: the dose only required one escalation step. You go from 2 milligrams to 4 milligrams. That's it, clean, simple, and nearly 20% body weight is gone. The 9 milligram dose group, those people lost 64 pounds, nearly 26%. The 12 milligram dose, and this is where it gets a little remarkable, people lost an average of 70 pounds, 28.3% of their body weight. Let me put that into perspective. If you're 250 pounds, 28% of your body weight is 70 pounds. You're walking around at 180 after that 80-week trial. That is a fundamentally different body composition, different health profile, different quality of life. And here's another number that stands out even within the 80-week period. Among people on the 12 milligram dose, 45.3% lost 30% or more of their body weight. Nearly half of the participants crossed a threshold historically associated with bariatric surgery from a weekly injection at 80 weeks. Also worth flagging, 65% of those on the 12 milligrams ended their main trial with a BMI below 30, falling out of the obesity category entirely. Even more striking, more than a third of people who started with severe obesity, a BMI of 40, crossed that line. So to recap the baseline, even the main 80-week results are by any measure extraordinary. But here's the thing, that's not actually the story we're here to tell today, because then they kept going. Okay, so here's where it gets genuinely wild. The main trial was 80 weeks. That's it. That's where the 70-pound average lives. But a subset of 532 patients didn't stop there. They kept going for another 24 weeks on top of that. So we're talking 80 plus 24, 104 weeks total, just shy of 2 full years on the drug. Same participants, continuous treatment, just longer. Now, a couple things to know about this group before we get to the numbers. First, this wasn't a random sample. It was the first 532 eligible participants who completed the main 80-week period without stopping or permanently reducing their dose. So, by definition, these are people who tolerated the drug well enough to stick with it. Keep that in mind. Second, their starting weights were actually higher than the main trial, averages around 268 pounds, a BMI of nearly 43, heavier starting point, more severe obesity. And in the extension, something was done that makes the results even more interesting. Everyone, regardless of which dose they'd been on in the main trial, was escalated to a maximum tolerated dose of either 9 or 12 milligrams. So if you've been on the 4 milligrams for the first 80 weeks, you got bumped up. If you were already been on 12, you stayed there. Here's what happened. The group that had been on 4 milligrams during the main trial and escalated to a higher dose in the extension, they ended up losing an average of 73 pounds, so 27.9% of their body weight by week 104. Remember, at week 80, they were at around 47 pounds. They added another 26 pounds of loss in those final 24 weeks just by going to a higher dose. That is a remarkable response to escalation. The 9 milligram group escalated to maximum tolerated dose, landed at an average of 80.7 pounds lost, so 29.5%. In the 12 milligram group, the people who'd been on the highest dose the whole time by week 104, they had lost an average of 85 pounds, so 30.3% of their body weight. From a starting weight of 268 pounds, the average person in this group was down to 183. Let me say that again. 85 pounds average over 2 years from a weekly shot. And even the people who have been on placebo for the entire 80 weeks main trial, when they finally were switched to Retatrutide in the extension, lost an average of almost 50 pounds in just the 24 weeks. 50 pounds in 6 months starting from scratch. What this extension tells us that the main 80-week data alone couldn't is that the drug may not have reached a plateau by week 80. People were still losing weight. The curve hadn't flattened, which raises the genuinely fascinating question of how long the weight loss continues with sustained treatment. We don't have a clean answer to that yet. The extension wasn't designed to find the ceiling. It was designed to get a longer look at efficacy and safety. But the signal is there. More time equals more loss. And that has real implications for how this drug might eventually be used in practice. These numbers are frankly not normal for a pharmaceutical trial, they're extraordinary. Okay, and there's always a but. Let's talk about the side effects because if a drug sounds too good to be true, your first question should always be, what's the catch? The side effect profile here is pretty consistent with the rest of the GLP-1 class, which is both reassuring and still worth knowing about. The big ones are nausea, diarrhea, constipation, and vomiting. On the highest dose, nausea hit around 42% of the people, diarrhea about 32%, and constipation about 26%. Vomiting was about 25%. That sounds like a lot, and it is, but most of these are worse in the early weeks when you're ramping up, and they tend to taper off as your body adjusts. The discontinuation rate is worth noting as well. On the 12 milligram dose, about 11.3% of the people stopped taking the drug because of the side effects, compared that to 4.9% on placebo. So roughly 6 to 7% more people quit the drug than quit the sugar shot, specifically because of how they felt. And that's real, and that also matters. There's also something a bit new in this trial that you don't hear much about with Ozempic and Zepbound, and that's dysesthesia. That's an abnormal sensation on the skin, like tingling and burning, or that feeling when your foot falls asleep, but in random places. About 12.5% of the 12 milligram group experienced this versus less than 1% on placebo. Most cases were mild to moderate, and most resolved on their own, but it's a signal worth watching. Urinary tract infections came up slightly more in the drug groups too, around 8% versus 5% on placebo. Again, mild to moderate. Now, there's no thyroid cancer flag here the way there was with some of the early GLP-1 drugs in animal studies, though that's still listed as a warning across this drug class out of caution. The point is, this isn't a free lunch. The side effects are real. They're manageable for most people, but not everyone. And that 11% dropout rate at the highest dose tells you the highest dose isn't right for everybody, which is actually why having a 4 milligram option that still gets you to 90% weight loss matters. So let's zoom way out because I think sometimes in these drug trial breakdowns, we get so deep in the milligrams and the percentages that we lose the thread of why this matters. Obesity is not a character flaw, it's not a willpower problem, it's a chronic, complex neurometabolic disease. Those are the words of the lead researcher on this study, Dr. Anaya Jastaboff from Yale, and it has been chronically undertreated. For decades, the medical options were diet and exercise, which work but are extremely hard to sustain, a handful of older medications with modest effects and real safety concerns, or surgery. Bariatric surgery works remarkably well for many people, but it's expensive, it's invasive, and it carries real surgical risks, and it's simply not accessible to most people who need it. What's happened in the last 5 to 10 years with the GLP-1 class of drugs is genuinely one of the bigger developments in obesity medicine in a generation, and retatrutide looks like it might be taking that another significant step further. If this drug gets FDA approval, and there's no guarantee of that yet, but it probably will. More on that in a sec. But you'd have to have a weekly injection that gets about half of patients to bariatric surgery level weight loss without surgery and beyond the scale. Lilly reported that retatrutide showed significant improvements in waist circumference, cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, and inflammation markers. These are the downstream effects of obesity that actually kill people: heart disease, stroke, metabolic syndrome. If you're moving these numbers, you're not just making people lighter, you're potentially extending lives. All right, look, I told you at the top we'd get to the hype question. So let me put on my skeptic hat for a second, because this is a Lilly press release and we should be honest about what that means. This was not a peer reviewed journal publication. This is a company announcing its own drug results ahead of a medical conference. The data hasn't been independently scrutinized yet in the way that happens when it goes through full peer review. Lilly has a financial incentive to put the best possible face on these numbers. And to be clear, they are impressive numbers, but the full picture often has nuance you don't see in a press release. A few things I want to know more about when the full data drops. Who dropped out? The efficacy numbers are for people who stayed on the drugs, but if you drop out, your weight loss doesn't count in the primary results. The 11% dropout rate on the high dose, what happened to those people's outcomes? What happens when you stop? This is the question that haunts the entire GLP-1 category. Basically, every study that looked at stopping these drugs has shown significant weight regain. Retatrutide almost certainly follows the same pattern. This is likely a drug you need to take indefinitely to maintain results, which is fine if it's affordable and accessible, but those are very big ifs. Now let's talk about cost and access. Zepbound, Lilly's current weight loss drug, lists at over $1,000 a month before insurance or rebates, before the cash price and all of that. Lots of insurance plans still won't cover it. Retatrutide isn't even approved yet, but if history is any guide, access is going to be a major issue. The company is pursuing a biologic classification for this drug rather than a peptide designation. And that distinction matters enormously for pricing. Biologic list price typically range from $10,000 to $300,000 or more annually, depending on the condition being treated, which should give you a clear picture of where costs are likely to land. Access is another concern. Retatrutide is unlikely to be a first-line option available to anyone who asks. More probably, it will function as an escalation therapy reserved for patients who have already tried and failed Zepbound, or those carrying a severely elevated BMI. Think class 3 obesity, formerly called morbid obesity, defined as a BMI of 40 or higher. There's also a business logic angle to consider. Zepbound and Mounjaro are blockbuster medications generating substantial revenue for Eli Lilly. It's hard to imagine the company aggressively positioning retatrutide in a way that cannibalizes its own tirzepatide franchise. The glucagon effect. The triple mechanism is exciting, but it also introduces complexity. Glucagon can affect muscle mass, bone density, and other metabolic processes in ways that aren't fully understood yet at scale. The more levers you pull, the more ways things can go differently than you expected. None of this means the drug is bad. The trial results are genuinely impressive, but impressive phase 3 results and the drug that solves obesity are different claims, and we should hold the line between them. So, where does retatrutide go from here? The full results are being presented at the American Diabetes Association scientific sessions, and Lilly says they'll be publishing in peer-reviewed journals. That's where the real scientific community gets to dig into the methodology, the raw data, the things the press release glosses over. Meanwhile, Lilly has more Triumph trial coming. Triumph 2 is the same drug in people who do have type 2 diabetes, and Triumph 3 is for people with existing cardiovascular disease. The company is also running trials on retatrutide for sleep apnea, knee pain, liver disease, and more. If everything goes well, if the safety data holds up, if the FDA is satisfied, we could be looking at retatrutide approval applications within the next year or two, though that timeline can always slip or move up earlier. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to. Lilly now has three significant obesity drugs in play. Zepbound is already approved and on the market. Foundayo, the oral GLP-1, just got approved, and now retatrutide is clearing phase 3. That's a portfolio play, and it's designed to match different patients with different needs. Some people want a pill, not a shot. Some people need modest weight loss with fewer side effects. And some people need the full bariatric level intervention without the surgery. Having options for all of those, that's actually good for patients if they can access it. All right, that's the retatrutide story as of today. Here's my honest take. This is one of the more genuinely exciting drug trials results I've seen in this space. The numbers are real, the mechanisms make sense, and if the peer reviewed data holds up the way the press release presents it, we're looking at a meaningful step forward for obesity medicine, but we're not there yet. It's not approved. The full data isn't published. Access and costs remain huge unresolved questions. And like every drug in this class, maybe especially this one, stopping it likely means the weight comes back. So, cautiously optimistic, eyes open, we'll keep watching. If you found this breakdown useful, hit subscribe. I try to do this once a week, one health story broken down in a way you can actually understand it. Drop a comment if you have questions, if you think I missed something, or if you just want to argue about BMI as a metric, because honestly, that's a whole other episode, which I already did. I'm RMZ. This is the Weekly Shot. See you on the next one. And don't forget to hit the hype button if you're watching in the app. Thank you.